Thanks, Adam, and thanks everyone for joining. The topic of today's talk is the oil market, and specifically, we're going to be looking at the how satellite imagery can be used to measure some key parts of the oil supply chain. So, namely, inventories and production. First, just some quick introductions. My name is Jeff Craig. I'm the global energy analyst at Ursa Space. Prior to Ursa, I was a market reporter for S&P Global Platts. There I covered oil futures, renewables, emissions markets, among other things. And before that, I got started covering energy when I was based in the Middle East for a number of years as a journalist and analyst. I'm joined by my colleague, Zach Downey. Zach's our lead data analyst at Ursa. His job is to extract and analyze, visualize the data across all of our products and services. Before Ursa, Zach worked at Xenia, also as a data scientist, and he recently completed a master's from Cornell in applied science and applied statistics and data science. As I mentioned, the topic today is oil. And even if you're not someone who really cares about oil in the oil market, it's still a topic worth getting into if you're perhaps more interested in how satellite imagery can be applied for commercial use cases. In general, I think for this industry, we're still kind of in the early stages for developing really good use cases for satellite imagery. And specifically here, talking about synthetic aperture radar imagery. So oil for some years now has been an industry where SAR has been used to measure inventories, and so in that regard, it kind of provides some template for a successful use case. Why has oil worked? Well, for a few reasons, but first you consider the size of the oil market. It's obviously vast, so you have a very large audience, a lot of potential people who would be interested in this product. But also oil, if you think about the oil market, it's everywhere, right? I mean, there's not a part of the world that doesn't have some piece of infrastructure involving the oil market, and that just reflects the role of oil in the global economy. But it's visible from space. As I mentioned, there's definitely infrastructure to monitor. The market itself is also it trades every minute of the day, right? So it kind of requires a lot of data, requires high frequency data and reliability of measurements. All of those requirements fit well with satellite imagery, and I think more specifically, synthetic aperture radar, SAR. As a company, Ursa Space Systems specializes in SAR imagery. That's where our background came from as a company, and so we call ourselves a satellite intelligence company. And again, we're sort of processing, collecting satellite imagery, performing advanced analytics on that imagery, and delivering a solution to customers in a very user-friendly format, whether it's an API or other kind of visualization tools. Our clients are both commercial as well as government. But let's get started here. And if you look at the screen I'm sharing right now, you'll see two images. The point here is just to kind of show you a little bit about the difference between optical and SAR imagery. It's something that maybe folks are familiar with, but I like to think a picture's worth 1,000 words. And the difference here, obviously, is that SAR with radar, you cut through clouds, smog, or for that matter, if it's nighttime, it's not an issue. So both of these images are actually taken at the same place. It's above Ningbo, China, at the same time of day. But you can see SAR was effective at penetrating through the clouds. Another image I wanted to show to you kind of quickly is what a tank farm looks like. So as I mentioned, one of the things we're going to be talking about is inventories. And oil is stored, crude oil is primarily stored in tanks like the one shown here. And this is an SAR image. But the idea here is that these are tanks where the lid is floats, depending on how full the tank is. So we're collecting imagery that covers large areas like the one shown here, where we'll have a lot of tanks, and we can do measurements looking at the height of the lid plus the size of the tanks. You perform some geometry, and what you're left with is how much oil is stored in those tanks, and then we're aggregating it across. Could be the individual terminal, then up to a country, and ultimately a global level. Now, why is this important? Well, it's kind of a cliche, but it's true. What matters in a market is supply and demand, and more specifically, it's the balance of supply and demand that's going to move the price. In this case, the price of oil. So the connection here is that the balance of supply and demand in the oil market is inventories. So when there's more supply than demand, inventories rise. And when there's less supply than demand, then inventories will fall. So it's a very important driver for the price of oil. And that's kind of the hook. That's why people care about inventories. Now, our coverage is global. We're looking at almost 200 locations around the world. It's more than 4 billion barrels of capacity. That number means anything to you. But let's take a look here at another screen, which is a dashboard we've created to show two things. One is our coverage, and then the other part of it is just getting a little flavor for some of the results here and what we're seeing. But let's start with this map here that you'll see. And this is showing, as I mentioned, the 200 sites that we cover. And you get a little bit of an idea here. Again, each one of these markers here indicates a place that we're covering. And as you can see, it's a global product. We have locations we're monitoring in China. That's the biggest country. Certainly, Asia is a major center for the oil market. But then, of course, the Middle East is important as a supplier to the market. Europe is also important, mostly as a consumer. And then in the Americas, you have the U.S., which today is both a major consumer, but also a major producer. So it's it's unique in that regard, being both a seller and a buyer for oil, as well as South America. And you have countries like Venezuela, major producer, but also one where it's been very volatile of late because of sanctions. So that's our coverage there. Now, again, as I mentioned, the idea of inventories, why people care, it has to do with balance of supply and demand. In certain times when the market is very volatile, people really care about inventories because they want to get some ground truth, and a lot of assumptions are thrown out the window. There couldn't be a better example of this than in 2020 when the outbreak of COVID occurred, and suddenly there was major questions, major uncertainties about oil demand, right? All of a sudden, people weren't driving, they weren't flying, and oil demand for sure was collapsing. How much was kind of anyone's guess. So that's why inventories were important, because it provided a sense of really where the balance of supply demand would ultimately end up. The result, as you might expect, was that inventories shot up. They started to increase by a lot. Now, to kind of capture this idea, we've broken up countries into 3 different categories where inventories can be considered high, middle, and low in 3 different colors. So high is green, the orange color is low, and white is middle. And so then we could put countries into different buckets, and we can see here how many countries fell into each one of those buckets. Now keep in mind here, green is the high category. So what you would expect when COVID happened and demand slowed and inventories increased was that more countries would be part of this high category. And that's what we found here. So at the beginning of the year, you had 5, 6 countries sometimes who were in the high category, countries where that can be considered having high levels of inventories. As 2020 progressed and inventory started to increase, more and more countries fell in this high category. 19 countries on May 28th. By early July, or July 16th, 20 countries here. So that said something about the state of the market that people cared about. What's interesting is that there's been kind of a second chapter written that we're probably still in the middle of, but country economies started reopening, demand started to recover, and also supply started coming off the market as well. So as a result, the market did start to tighten a little bit. And by that, I mean inventory started to fall. Fewer countries, some countries fell out of that high category. And so you see the green line here, keep your eye on that. It's starting to decline over time, and it's still kind of on that downward path. That said, there's still more countries in the high category today than there were at the beginning of 2020. So that, in a nutshell, is an overview of inventories and some of the recent takeaways from the data. As I mentioned, it's interesting because there has been a supply response to the COVID outbreak. And so what happened was that when prices fell, as you'd expect, production started to decline. And it came from 2 places. One was the U.S., and my colleague Zach will be talking about that next, the supply response and how we're able to track some U.S. production using satellite imagery. The other place where supply responded was the Middle East. And you had OPEC getting together, deciding to cut output, try to give prices a boost. One country who belongs to OPEC is Libya. However, they were actually exempted from the agreement. The reason why was just because their production was already very low. And the reason why there was because of the political instability, the fighting in the country has taken a lot of supply off the market. But I want to turn to Libya next, because here we can still see how satellite imagery can be used to monitor production. The technique here is a little different. So before I was describing synthetic aperture radar, and that's really the main tool we use as a company. Another tool at our disposal is flaring data. So this is on NASA satellites. You have a sensor that is an infrared sensor that will be picking up on the flare stacks in an oil field. So it's picking up on the heat from a flare stack. Because it's in an oil field, we know that this is likely coming from it's likely flaring. When gas flaring itself is associated with, in this case, oil production. So a lot of times a country or a company may not have the pipelines, the facilities to capture the natural gas associated with oil production, and as such it flares it. It's actually a major problem environmentally. It's kind of wasteful if you think about it, but nonetheless, that's the situation for a lot of places around the world. As kind of a unintended consequence of that, we can use this gas flaring information as a proxy for oil production. So here, as I mentioned, Libya, it's been very volatile. There's a civil war going on, and in a lot of cases, fields have been shut because of some groups have taken control of the field from a state-owned oil company. What you're looking at here is a picture of part of the El Sharara oil field, Libya's largest oil field. It's about 700 kilometers south of Tripoli. And normally, its production can be 300,000 barrels per day. But we've seen Sharara become kind of a prize, if you will, in the civil war there in Libya, where different factions are fighting for control of the oil field. So when we look at the actual data from the flaring that's associated, that comes from Al Sharara, we see periods where the flaring drops to zero. This graph is showing flaring going back to July 2018. And we've mashed up different moments here in the timeline with known events to have occurred. What we see is times where, again, where the blue line here, the graph shows the flaring dropping to zero. And what that suggests is that the field has been shut down. And when you look at the timing, it makes sense. Late 2018 to early 2019, National Oil Corporation of Libya lost control of the field, and reportedly the production ceased. There was a very brief period in summer of 2019 where something similar happened, and again, you see it. Moving forward to 2020, it's been one of the big stories in Libya, has been the blockade of oil fields and ports by forces allied with General Haftar, who has been fighting for control of Libya. And so, again, you've seen the field basically, Al Sharara, shut, according to the flaring data, starting in earlier this year. Just last week, a ceasefire was announced and production is expected to resume. This kind of shows here why the flaring data is important, because you want to be able to use this data to see whether those stories, in fact, whether the news accounts are accurate or not, and that actually happens. We can also look at flaring for the whole country, combined with known estimates of production. The point here is just to try to show that flaring can be a good proxy for production. So here we've looked at the entire country, again, in the blue line. The darker line is a known estimate of Libyan crude production that comes from an OPEC monthly report. So the same exercise you could do in other countries. Libya happens to be a good example because it's been a very volatile situation. So it gives us an opportunity to see what happens when we hear about specific oil fields closing for extended periods of time. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Zach, who is going to continue with this idea of production. But his example will be in the US, but again, using satellite imagery to monitor production. Zach?
All right. Thank you, Adam, and thanks to everybody watching. As Jeff gave me such a kind introduction before, I am Zach Downey. I'm the lead data scientist at URSA. And as we're switching it around a little bit, first I'm going to talk about U.S. production and the effects we've been noticing on U.S. shale drilling. And then, as Adam mentioned, Jeff will come back in and he'll finish up the story focusing a little bit on Libya. So, as Jeff talked about, there is an extremely important focus on U.S. production of oil and gas as an impact on the market, as supply and demand alter in this crazy global economy we're living in nowadays. It's really important to have a good sense of activity picking back up. So the focus we're going to talk a little bit about today is the status of oil drilling activity. We're going to look at a few really interesting equipment yards all over the United States, both in the northern part of the U.S. in North Dakota, but also in the Permian area and in Dunklin, Oklahoma. We're going to talk a little bit about how SAR can answer some interesting questions. And I've got them here on the screen, but just a few examples. Are crews being dispatched to resume drilling? Which shale plays are restarting, if at all? Will U.S. production continue to grow? Like Jeff talked about, supply and demand is such a delicate balance. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and from a context perspective. And then I'm going to show some interesting data that we've been collecting at URSA that will paint an interesting picture. So first, I want to give a little bit of context. What's an equipment yard? What does that really mean? And first, I want to show this optical image from our friends at Black Sky that shows an equipment yard in Duncan, Oklahoma, as I referred to before. This is owned by Halliburton, which you may have heard of. It is a monstrous yard filled with idle equipment, and as you'll see in some of the zoomed in photos in a bit, rigs themselves that are kept here as production starts to decline. Activity is not important. It is not economical to continue producing based on the current oil price. So in response, all these drills and equipment have to go somewhere. These companies will put them in these yards, just sitting idle, hoping to be used in the near future. So one of the things we're going to talk about is how we can use that and how we can use SAR-based analytics to derive some interesting value from looking at areas just like this. So pulling it a step back, think about why this matters really. And this ties a little bit into what Jeff was talking about before. When the economy had its shock, oil prices went along with it. Oil prices dropped significantly starting in late February into March. And with it, like I talked about, the rig count as well. You can see the graph over here on the right shows the rig count at all-time lows around now. And that plummet happened around the time that the economy hit some major shocks. So this obviously led to a significant drop in U.S. production. And with that, there's this ebb and flow, this equilibrium balance between supply and demand. As U.S. production began to fall dramatically, prices began to rise again. Not the only factor, but a significant factor in allowing prices to kind of pick back up from that really low point as U.S. production falls. You can see the same thing here. We were showing the red line, the WTI, NYMEX WTI, or oil price in the U.S., against the Baker Hughes oil and gas rig count throughout the entire United States. And you can see exactly what happens here. The price plummets, and as a response, the rig count also plummets as well. But it takes a little bit of time because there needs to be a response. There's a physical movement of things, rigs coming out and being moved to an area, which we'll get to in a second. And that's the response on dropping oil prices. As prices begin to rise, however, you're not seeing the build back up of rigs. And that's interesting. There's a couple of reasons why that's the case. The first is that there's a concept called a shut-in, which is that the process is set in place to turn a rig back, turn production back on at a specific location. And it doesn't involve having a rig go there, re-drilling, going through the process again. It just, you can turn it back on sometimes as easy as an app from your phone. The other reason we're not seeing it is because of the amount of time delay it takes to get these rigs and all the equipment to the locations where they want to frack and produce. So, but it is very interesting. We are seeing an increase in prices, but not necessarily an increase in rigs. So the question is, when will we see that? Where will we see that? And is there some market advantage in knowing that information first? So getting back to what we're going to be looking at, here's another example of one of these equipment yards in Midland, Texas. You can actually see this one contains the rigs themselves, just basically lined up, sitting there ready to be used, and just building and growing. These man-made metallic objects are spot-on perfect use case for SAR to monitor them with pretty consistent accuracy. I'll show another couple examples. This one's in Williston, North Dakota. This is near the Bakken oil field, which is the third largest producer in the U.S. after the Permian and Eagle Ford. And last example I'll show is in Duncan, Oklahoma, the one I mentioned previous. You can even see all the trucks and the fracking, liquid trucks, and just the rest of the equipment that's utilized here. So as production declines, as drilling is not necessary, you see this buildup of activity at these facilities. So then obviously the question is, how do we monitor them? How do we quantify that in a way that we can tie back to production, oil prices, and the rig count in an interesting way? So we're going to talk a little bit about what we call the SAR activity index, utilizing the SAR activity index specifically for these equipment yards. I've only shown you 3 here, but there are a variety of these all throughout the Permian, all throughout the Williston, North Dakota, Bakken area. They're all over and they're gathering. Certain ones are owned by certain companies. And that's the other interesting thing too. If you can get an idea of which companies are which yards, you can kind of slice and dice the data in some interesting and meaningful ways. So I'll show you kind of what the SAR activity index looks like to prove that we're monitoring the right thing here. So this is the SAR activity index versus the rig count in West Texas around the Permian Basin. And you can see the inverse relationship that they have. You can see as rig count slowly dropping throughout the end of last year to this year. You saw the activity index start to build. But as soon as that drop in rig count happens, it's accompanied by an inverse correlation with the SAR activity index. And you can see we're also at an all-time high, and we've been at an all-time high in this area for a significant amount of time. In case there's a question about it, you can see here the way we capture this activity index is kind of similar how Jeff was describing the high, medium, and low oil inventory data. A number above 1 indicates that it's greater than the average, or a number below 1 indicates that it's lower than the average. It's a normalized value that helps us get some sort of basis to correlate and compare to some of the other data we're seeing in this case. But you can see that in this area, all-time high. And we talked a little bit about here about how the number of active rigs in the Permian fell from 418 on March 12th to 141 on June 4th, a significant drop. And that was right around the same time that we saw this large increase here, one of the largest changes we've seen in the SAR activity index throughout the entire history of the monitoring. You can see in these few weeks here that we see this jump. Another interesting one is in the Williston Basin, which I showed the example in the Bakken. However, in this case, you see the same effect, right? They're kind of steady. They're both kind of steady, and then you get that strong decrease in rigs accompanied with a strong increase in the SAR activity index. The interesting, though, is our most recent Williston activity index value shows that actually might be coming back. That actually might be indicating that equipment is being pulled away from the yards and is starting to be utilized again. We're not seeing that yet in the rig count, but we're thinking that that's probably what we're going to see in the upcoming weeks. It's pretty interesting. And last but not least, looking at Woodford Shale. All right, we're seeing a similar effect, except in this case, instead of them both kind of plateauing and then reacting, you actually see them being really, really well inversely correlated since September of 2018. You see the effect, the SAR activity index is really strongly correlated to the rig count. And you can see that, again, similar to the Halliburton yard, or the Halliburton yard in Duncan is similar to the other Permian yards we're looking at, where you're at an all-time high and you aren't necessarily seeing that come back down to earth yet. So that's pretty much it for the SAR activity index. In general, we believe that by tracking these types of proxies, one can get a really good sense of activity happening all around the world. This is just an example of the SAR activity index. Jeff and Daniel Baruch last week talked a little bit about Amazon and Tesla monitoring auto manufacturing plants and Amazon fulfillment centers is another thing. We use the same types of metrics to get a sense of activity, and we've seen how those correlate to things like stock prices and cars indices and things like that. So really interesting stuff, and really ties into this production story that we're dealing with right now. So thank you very much for having me, and I will hand it back to Adam to get Jeff to jump back in. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to bring Zach into the conversation as well, because I think we're in a question and a session at this time, just by where we're at. Both of you completed your presentations. And with that said, I don't see too many questions from the audience right now coming in. However, with that said, I do have a couple myself, and to piggyback off of some of the session we had last week, and I was getting into things like Tesla and Amazon. I want to ask some of the similar questions with the oil and gas for folks who are interested. Whether you pick which one want to take this question on, but talk to me about why. How has SAR been a game changer in identifying some of these change detection or some of these narratives behind oil and gas compared to traditional methods of monitoring these activities?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. So as I mentioned before, I used to cover the oil market as a reporter, and there I was very versed in kind of the data sources that people would talk about and that would inform the kind of market and the trading. So the market has relied mostly on government sources. It's probably been the biggest source of data for the market. But that's very limited. It's very limited. It doesn't really do justice to the size of the market. It's very U.S.-centric. U.S., Europe, let's say primarily. And that might have made sense years and years ago when the rest of the world was kind of on the periphery. It's certainly not the case anymore. China, Asia, it's probably the center of demand. It's not a stretch to say this. And for many years, it's been not only large in terms of the in an absolute sense, but it's also been growing. Okay, so that's another difference. So getting data from Asia was never easy. It's still not easy. So SAR is a way of being able to cover areas of the world that were never really accessible before in a kind of in a very reliable fashion. Zach, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, sure. So with my data science hat on, I would say not only is it easier to get access to data in certain parts of the world at all, but the data itself that you get out of SAR-derived analytics is cleaner, it's easier. The ability to see through clouds and see at night and all that stuff just makes it, you get a consistent data set. You know you're looking at the same thing every time. You don't have to guess. You don't have to deal with interpolation strategies and assumptions that are all baked into your process and your model that just make it a little, puts you a little more queasy than some of the other data you may have dealt with. So SAR has been fantastic in that it, like I said, allows for just a consistent data set. You're getting frequent revisits over certain areas of the world. Like Jeff said, areas where you might not have had revisit at all with other sensor with consistency. So yeah, I think it's just been, it's made my life easier, I would say. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thanks for answering that question. Next thing I kind of want to ask about is the specifics of, you're monitoring things like oil tanks and storage and just equipment yards, et cetera, to figure out what's going on at each one of these locations. So talk to me about the process. How many facilities you have to monitor to kind of get a baseline of the overall economic indicators for what's going on across the industry.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. It definitely depends on what you're looking into. The luxury with the process that we've put in place across a lot of our products and services is the ability to quickly scale. Our process in ingesting imagery and analyzing imagery at scale makes it that you're able to. It's not between 5 and 50. Not a huge difference in most cases. So, but like I said, it depends on what you're looking at. With auto manufacturing plants, I think we're up to about 100 now that we're monitoring all over the globe. With oil inventories, I think Jeff mentioned it before, we're at about 200 locations all over the globe. It's about 4 billion barrels of oil. So, to get a baseline is an interesting thing. It depends on what you're looking for, trying to capture with the equipment yards. Just looking at the one in Duncan, Oklahoma that I talked about was a baseline because that's such a large facility. It's so representative of what's happening around it that you can kind of use it as a proxy for the rest. And we've seen that with the other equipment yards we've been monitoring. So I think it depends, but Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, there's the notion in the market of kind of the incremental supply, for example, or that kind of marginal, that place where it's moving the needle, right? So it's not just about how the scale. The scale helps the scale always helps, but if you're not able to scale up and be completely comprehensive, you do want to think about why you're looking at a certain place, and not every place matters as much as the next. So if you're able to select really key areas that are kind of that marginal kind of source, then you're able to accomplish more with less. So it's kind of a mixture, I think, of it too.
Yeah, in terms of just to piggyback off that, Jeff, in terms of comprehending, analyzing, and visualizing that data. The less you have that provides your point, the better, in a sense, in that, like, you don't have to deal with all of the information and trying to make sense of it in the complicated web of all of it. Sometimes if the one thing, if the small subset of information you have really drives that point home, then it's easier to express it, easier to visualize it, easier to from it.
So this one actually did come from the audience. I'm the only one we got so far, and I hesitate to bring this up only because there is only a slight overlap with the oil industry. But you all have done some amazing work recently covering the recent oil spill. And can you talk about how you monitor incidents like that occur, and how that affects maybe the economic indicators that you see on SAR as well? I'm trying to keep that question on topic of this discussion, so I kind of.
Well, it's
I back it.
Sure. Yeah, so you're referencing the oil spill off the coast of Mauritius. It's been a big event. It's been a big event that a lot of people care about. People in the oil industry, but also anyone. I mean, it's a major environmental catastrophe. So one thing about SAR, one application for it has been detecting oil spills. It works well it can really accurately capture the size of an oil spill. So that was a pretty well-known application for SAR for some time. And then when this event happens, again, it's a place where relatively remote in a sense, and it's really helped for people on the ground in terms of the cleanup operation, because it's a pretty large area where the spill has happened. So just to back up for a second, it was a bulk carrier that ran aground on 25th, just off the coast of southeast Mauritius. And another aspect too of this was using SAR and AIS to understand the course the ship took when it deviated from the shipping lane. Also, we've been able to track some of the ships in the area that have been helping that were helping in the operation. And then we recently followed the ships that have towed part of the vessel away from the scene. So a lot of people will be watching to see where it's next. Zach, what do you think? Anything I missed there as far as the use case?
Yeah, no, I think you explained it really well. I think the only other things I would add are that, when especially something like this, where it's granular, it's detailed, it's interesting for a variety of reasons, and people can read it, and you can make sense of it, why it matters, why you care, why you're looking at it. It helps make the case for the more scaled version of the same thing. A little bit, right? Like this idea of, if you can do that for that one ship off the coast of Mauritius, the world in which you're tracking globally, you're tracking all of these things that can happen. You're allowing first responders to get on the ground faster. And when these things happen, you have analytics you can look to give you that.
And I'll add that scale, I think, is very important because that's how we can connect it to this topic of discussion, where it's the economic indicators for the oil industry, right? You're monitoring these things at scale. So if something happens like this spill, you can rapidly monitor the effect of that for that area, but also rapidly impact the impact across that entire industry on a regional level as well. So what do they do in response to that? Or even if there's any conflicts in areas where there's a lot of refineries or oil wells, et cetera, what are the impact of those by measuring the storage facilities, et cetera, right? So I think we're also finding how you all are doing an interesting job at how to do this rapidly. I think our last discussion, Jeffrey, you were the one who mentioned that SAR compared to traditional economic monitoring, it comes down to the speed and accessibility. Before you get these reports, monthly, if not quarterly, and now you can monitor this from a day-to-day, if not a weekly basis. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's the frequency is an ability to respond kind of ad hoc fashion too. So you never know when an event's going to occur, when and where, right? So it's a real test of your ability to have in place all of the pieces that you need. It's not easy. So it takes time to have all of that ready and kind of, so you have a tool to whenever and wherever you need to.
And one more thing I'll add is not that this is actionable from a speed standpoint, but SAR, as opposed to other sensors, this is also actionable from a measurability standpoint. You can actually measure the impact that's going on, measure how much oil is spilled from an area covered, or measure how much oil is at a specific facility. And that's a game changer from the speed that you're doing it at. But the measurement thing is a huge game changer across sensors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Adam, you used the word that I was going to mention too, impact, right? That word, not just the impact of the thing you're looking at, but the impact that it has across the rest of the supply chain, across the rest of the world. Not only I'm measuring this thing, but if that thing changes, what is the impact of that on something else that I'm also monitoring? And you can tie those things together and weave a narrative that actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so with that said, I'm going to ask you both, since we got cut off early in a certain place or two. And I know, Zach, you were successfully able to complete your side of things pretty well. But between the both of you, is there anything that you feel like we've not hit on, not missed with your presentation that you think it's important to relay to the audience around this topic of economic indicators with oil and gas industry based off of SAR that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
One of the things, Adam, you've kind of gotten into this in other sessions you've done, but the idea again of trying to develop use cases. It's a kind of a theme I notice you go back to again and again. You often ask your panelists, what are some use cases and applications? And one of the things I picked up on watching some of your other videos is this idea that there's kind of an educational element to all of this. So we're trying to inform people about how to use SAR, because I think some of your other panelists have mentioned how it's still kind of the early days. It's not a fully mature business, so it's important to get out there and to kind of show people very specific cases. And I think hopefully it starts to resonate with people, and kind of you take one idea. I think as you were getting at just a second ago, you take one idea, one application, and even if it's not exactly what you care about, you take it in a different direction.
Yeah. Jumping on that same point, as Jeff said, I think the analytics we've produced and the usage of SAR, we always internally and also the people we talk to, we try to push creativity and innovation as much as possible. If you can do that, think about the other things you can monitor, right? Just the possibilities are endless with SAR. And we, like Jeff said, we're trying to educate. We try to show you examples of things. But the hope is that you think beyond that. You think outside the box. You think about how SAR-based analytics, especially when you're fusing it with other information, can be important.
Great. No, I appreciate that. So with that said, I want to thank you both for coming back on. But I think this is an awesome session, very informative. And I want to thank you both for coming on and running through, once again, the helping us understand production equipment and yard indicators based off of the SAR, or we'll call it radar sensors that are out there. So appreciate it.